Today we're discussing the new leasing standard. Issued in February, many companies are still trying to understand the provisions, evaluate the implications, and assess the necessary system, process, and control changes. With me today are Soares and Sheri Wyatt. Sheri is a partner in our capital markets accounting advisory services practice and has spent considerable time helping companies understand and evaluate the leasing standard. Chad is an assurance partner who was most recently in our national office, where he's been following the standard since its early deliberations. Sheri, I know PwC and CBRE recently surveyed accounting, finance, and real estate executives about how they're approaching the leasing standard. What did you find?
Yeah, so one of the main reasons why we wanted to do the survey is we really want to understand where companies were in their process. This standard has been discussed for numerous years, right? So trying to see, are companies thinking about starting today or starting later? What we found was about 70% of companies are actually planning to begin the implementation process in 2016, with 30% of those already starting. So what that suggests to me is that companies view this as being a really significant change that's going to take some time in order to implement, and they're being really proactive about their process and approach.
So even though it's not effective until 2019, that's earlier than you would think, given that you have to show the comparative periods.
That's right. So for a public calendar year company, they're going to be showing 2017 and 2018. 2017 is right around the corner.
So as they're starting the implementation, Chad, what are the concerns that people are facing right off the bat?
Well, look, pretty much all companies have leases of some sort. Right? For most companies, the change of putting most leases on balance sheet is going to be a very visible change for them. And I think a lot of people are focusing in on the fact that today a lot of that data is not necessarily easily accessible. And while some of the information about leases may have been captured, the process historically has really been a manual process. So how we shift from that manual process to a more system-based process is going to be a real challenge.
Throughout our survey and all of our webcasts, that's been one of the questions that we've asked. How are you currently managing your leases? And the survey revealed that 70% of companies are currently using spreadsheets in order to manage their leases. And even more so, 84% are extracting the key terms of those leases manually. And so that's where we're going to see companies start to think about leveraging technology, not only from the extraction perspective, but also for the ongoing accounting for their leases. Currently, only 10% of companies are using an actual lease software system to do the accounting, and we're expecting that we're going to see some changes there.
So Chad, talk to me a little bit more about the concerns about data, maybe bring it down a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I think I'd break it down into two. I think the first is, how do I extract the data? Even if I have all of my files in a readily accessible place, and even if they're all in English, because they may not be, how do I get that data out? How do I bring it off the page? And then secondarily, once I brought it off the page, there's a lot of things that I'm going to have to do. Moving from a disclosure-only framework for the most part and expensing through the P&L for lots of leases to something that's resident on the balance sheet is going to change the way I think about that data and the processes that I need to deal with that data on an ongoing basis.
But Sheri mentioned that only 10% of companies are planning on using software or are currently using software. Yep. But there's actually been a lot of recent technological innovation in that area.
There has been, and I would really break it down into a couple of areas. When I go talk to clients, the first thing they're really focused on is, I need software to do the accounting. And in my mind, I actually think that's the second step, if you will. The first step is really thinking about, what is that software going to process? It needs information to be able to work effectively. And what's really exciting for us is there are some tools out there like our proprietary data sieve technology that we use for non-audit clients that can actually help you lift unstructured data, take and read contracts, and pull out the data that you need. That data is then readily available to be imported into a system or a technology or whatever process you decide to implement to do the ongoing financial reporting process.
And it's easy to focus on just the balance sheet, but with the new standard, there are a lot more disclosures than we have under the current leasing standard, pretty consistent with revenue recognition. And so having that data accumulated in a centralized place will help prepare you for those disclosures. A great example of that is the requirement to disclose your weighted average discount rate. Seems like a fairly simple concept, but if you don't have all the information in one place, it adds to the complexity of actually getting it right.
Yeah, the requirement isn't difficult at all, but just the execution of it across a portfolio.
And I'm assuming there's some information that's better just to visit at least once and capture it the first time without having to go back to it.
Absolutely right. You only want to do it once, particularly if you have a large volume of leases.
So it's concern about data, Chad, is that what our survey found as well?
It absolutely did. You know what's surprising? The accounting aspects of the standard, more than half of the respondents really weren't as concerned about that. They didn't feel like that would be the difficulty in the standard. It was about data, systems, process, controls.
And all those pieces really lead to getting a real good project management structure in place. So we mentioned before, companies are starting now. I think with the perspective of 2019 really isn't that far away.
That's great advice. Obviously, there is a lot that we can cover here. Maybe, Sheri, if you can give me some of a key takeaway.
I think the biggest takeaway, we've said this several times, is data. But really what we're hearing companies say when we talk to them is that they're really concerned about the data and their access to the data and the completeness and accuracy of the data that they may already have in a repository. And so that's where companies are starting to focus. And then once you get the data in a good centralized place, then there's, beyond the compliance, you can start thinking about what other business information, operational information that I can obtain from that data.
And Chad?
Yeah, I think the way I frame it in my mind is what to do now, what to do soon, and then what maybe I can do a little bit later. And now it's all about the data. Without data, a system isn't really all that useful to me. It doesn't give me a sense of how really I am going to be affected by this. So getting your arms around where your leases are, the quality of the information you may already have in place, is kind of key step one and starting as soon as possible. I think sooner rather than later, you also want to start thinking about that project planning timeline. What does my transition plan look like? When am I going to start wanting to potentially dual report before the standard's actually effective? Putting those milestones in place will help you understand your appropriate resource plan and things like that to be able to ease transition. And then ultimately the implementation of a system if you choose to get one, and the associated things like controls and things like that have to be thought through in that process.
Chad, Sheri, thank you so much for being here. I think your insights have been really helpful.
Thank you.
All of these items and more are discussed in detail on the Lease accounting page available at cfodirect.com.